Welcome, friends, to a presentation on queering Black churches, dismantling heteronormativity in African American congregations. I am Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, co-host of tonight's program.
And I'm Reverend Derrick Terry, Program Director of the Open and Affirming Coalition of the United Church of Christ, also co-host of this program.
LGBTQ-RAN is a unique venture dedicated to preserving the history of LGBTQ religious movements around the world. LGBTQ-RAN is a digital enterprise. We are not a physical repository that stores papers. We advise and support leaders and groups in their efforts to preserve their records in appropriate archives. Furthermore, we collect and provide a treasure of historical information on our website about LGBTQ plus persons and groups from a wide array of religious expressions around the world. And finally, we encourage research and scholarship in queer religious history.
And the Open and Affirming Coalition is an LGBTQ plus faith movement that works to help churches, seminaries, and other organizations through a process to become more open to and affirming of LGBTQ plus people. To date, we have more than 1,900 places that have gone through the process of developing and living out an ONA covenant. We work with churches, clergy, laity as needed. We support individuals who may need someone to help their churches or their space live out their ONA covenant. We also speak to the denomination, the United Church of Christ, to make sure that the LGBTQ plus community is affirmed and honored within our denomination as God's beloved children.
Tonight, we all get to hear LGBTQ-RAN advisor and pastor scholar, Reverend Dr. Derrick McQueen, interview Reverend Dr. Brandon Thomas Crowley on his newly published Queering Black Churches, Dismantling Heteronormativity in African American Congregations from Oxford University Press. In his book, Crowley argues for a systematic approach to dismantling homophobia within African American congregations that moves beyond surface level allyship toward actual structural renovation. Using the lenses of practical theology, ecclesiology, queer theology, and gender studies, Crowley examines the heteronormative histories, theologies, morals, values, and structures of Black churches and how their long-standing assumptions can be challenged. Drawing on the past experience of several historically Black churches that became open and affirming, Queering Black Churches explores how historically Black churches have queered their congregations.
And Reverend Derrick McQueen, PhD, is the pastor of St. James Presbyterian Church in Harlem, the oldest African-American Presbyterian church in New York City. Derrick serves as the chair of the board of directors for Auburn Theological Seminary, which equips bold and resilient leaders with the tools and resources needed for social justice, for the social justice movement in a multi-faith world. McQueen is the Associate Director for Community Partnerships at Columbia University Center on African American Religion, Sexual Policies, and Social Justice, better known as CARS. The project brings together scholars, activists, clergy, and communities for healing in historically Black church life culture. Reverend Dr. Brandon Thomas Crowley is an African-American pastor, preacher, author, and scholar in religion, theology, and queer theory. Since 2009, he has served as a senior pastor of the historic Myrtle Baptist Church in Newton, Massachusetts, one of America's oldest Black congregations, founded by formerly enslaved people at the end of Reconstruction, and one of the nation's few open and affirming historically Black churches. In addition to his pastoral role, Dr. Crowley is a lecturer in ministry studies at Harvard University's Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
And now, I am pleased to welcome Derrick McQueen and Brandon Thomas Crowley for an informative and probing discussion on queering Black churches.
Good evening, everyone. It is a joy to be here with you all this evening. And as I was saying earlier, I have so many pages of notes and we only have a little bit of time. So I'm looking forward more to this being a wonderful conversation with the spiritual brother that I've yet to meet face to face, but I feel him through these pages, and the smile that I see with him now has really been spoken to my heart in terms of this subject of queering Black churches, something that is near and dear to my heart and has been for a very long time. So I want to thank you, Brandon, once again for listening to the ancestors and listening to your spirit and listening to how the Holy Spirit has guided you to sort of take what your heart and spirit have felt and pour it into this systematic and very logical and helpful ways for our churches to really approach these issues. And I'm looking forward to being in conversation with you about that tonight. So welcome. And I am so grateful to see you.
I am so honored to be here. Thank you, Derrick, for this opportunity to be able to be in conversation with you. And I too feel the connection of God and spirit through your smile. We've been smiling. We've been just smiling at each other for the last couple of minutes. And I also want to extend my thanks to the Open and Affirming Coalition of the United Church of Christ, and a huge, huge thanks to the LGBT Religious Archives Network for the work that you do, both of these organizations, and to you for your ministry and the sacrifice that you give on a consistent basis. This is a huge honor of mine to be present with you all this evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Let us get into it. So I want to start by asking you a very simple question. It may not be quite a simple question, but I want to really start by thinking about the idea of ecclesial queering.
Mm-hmm.
It is such a powerful combination of words that, I never thought that I would see put together in my lifetime. And it has made me jump up out of my seat and do a happy dance every time I read it. So can you just sort of speak a little bit more to that technological term that actually is very hands-on and very nitty-gritty?
Yes. So I promise I'm going to answer your question. I'm going to go kind of roundabout to get there. I wrote this book because as a scholar, I felt that the information that many queer scholars were writing about and their scholarship was needed. It was an apologetic sort of form of making an argument and stating what the problems were. And then as time went on, and don't get me wrong, I love and respect all of my colleagues. I just got to the place where I was going, well, everybody's talking about the problem. Everybody is doing the work of deconstruction. Who is going to do the work of construction? And so I prayed. And, when you pray, God will respond back. But the question is, will you listen? And God responded to me and said, oh, yes, that fierce urgency and desire and hunger for construction, yeah, you're supposed to do it. And I thought to myself, oh, God, I don't want to do this, because as a scholar, you're very afraid sometimes that people are just going to pick apart what you've done. It's sort of the nature of the academy, and I had to just get used to that piece. And I was also fearful about being the first one out to sort of do this work. I had never seen someone do what I had a vision to do, which is to talk about the theory, but then to also bridge it to a form of practicality in some way. And so I wanted to bridge that gap between the practical and the theoretical, because I actually don't see a separation between the two. I actually believe that theory is embedded within praxis, and that is the best way to sort of excavate or to discover what a theory is, or what even a theology is, to look at the practices of the people. I'm a practical theologian, so that intersectional nature, that indistinguishability between the two is just who I am as a theorist. And so I wanted to construct a methodology that would be thick enough for academicians to wrestle with and to perhaps expand beyond what I did to initiate the conversation. But I also wanted it to be shallow enough for those who were not academicians, but they were practitioners of the faith and leaders in churches to be able to use and not feel like they were drowning in something that would not apply to their context. So what the Spirit gave to me, and I remember exactly where I was on Revere Beach walking my dog when this concept popped in my head of Black ecclesial queering. A very simple way of thinking about this is a lot of people think, okay, what Brandon's trying to do is to turn the whole church gay. No, not. That's not the goal of queering. The goal of queering is to really call the church back to itself, to call the church back to its original ecclesial mission of whosoever. That whosoever word is at the sort of crux of it. But Constantinian Christianity and colonialism caused us to pull away from that tradition. I'm speaking about the Church Universal now, and to create these very oppressive and heteronormative and sexist and very xenophobic ways of being in the world, and undergirding that with our theology and with our traditions. So Black ecclesial queering is really tools to dismantle the master's house. I'm familiar of the great warrior, fierce mother poet, who Audre Lorde, who talks about the fact not being able to dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. Well, Black ecclesial queering is not the master's tools. It is actually the tools that are carved out of the experiences of Black queer folk who've actually done this work. It's a methodology to, this is my favorite word in the world, to winnow. I use that in the book. Winnowing is one of my favorite terms. It is a sort of agricultural term that was used to blow the chaff away from the wheat when you're dealing with the threshing floor and what falls there. And what I am attempting to do with this methodology is to winnow Christian theology, to do the work of winnowing in the church, to remove those calluses, if you will, that have been put there by evil measures. And I keep leaning on puritanical Christianity and definitely Constantinian Christianity, which I don't consider to actually be Christianity as much as it is a sort of a form of godliness, but not according to knowledge. So Black ecclesial queering is a method that churches can use to queer their context, to make their context not just welcoming. Because one of the things that I argue in the work is that Black churches have historically dibbled and dabbled in don't ask, don't tell existence. And it is this idea that we have had queer folk in churches, Black churches operating for years. They have just not been able to operate fully walking in their full selves. You know, it's this idea of the closet, or you stand in the threshold, but don't come completely out. So Black ecclesial queering is really an attempt to help churches that are already welcoming and open to become affirming. And I just want to make this one demarcation, and then I'll stop for your next question. This book was not written to persuade thick heteronormative spaces to accept queer folk. This is actually written for spaces that say, well, we love gay people. We love lesbian. We love transgender persons. We just don't know how to deal with theology. We don't know how to deal with scripture. We don't know how to affirm them. We welcome them. We just don't know how to do the work of affirmation. This method teaches you how to do the affirmation, and it does it in a way that goes beyond what I describe as surface level allyship. Surface level allyship is putting the Black Lives Matter sign in front of your white church. Going beyond surface level allyship to the work of dismantling and construction means that you ask yourself as a white church, why do we want to put this sign out? What is our history with racism? What are the ways that we rehash outdated and toxic theologies, and it's become a part of our lexicon and our norm? It's asking those deep and intense questions to understand the why, to better comprehend the what and the who, in order to get us to the place of how.
It's exactly what I was hoping to hear. So thank you so much for that. It's a wonderful, wonderful deep dive already into the process and how you came here and where we're at with this. And I just wanted to get that wonderful term, because you have so many wonderful ways that you break down these terms within your work that have really been very inspiring. I want to really speak to something that I just want to share with you in this conversation. I am so intrigued in a joyous way in your breakdown of the Christian apologetic and the move away from the Christian apologetic. That idea that I have to just explain this, so that I always had this idea about, I'm tired of being asking if I could sit at the table.
Yes.
So that's not where I'm coming from, right? So when you talk about that, and you talk about it underneath the framing of the way that Mark Jordan talks about, the apologetic and moving against the apologetic and womanism and all of that wonderful stuff. But you have this incredible quote in the book that really speaks to a lot of what you spoke about in terms of this welcoming and this affirming. It's like, therefore, what is it that you say? You say, congregational queering teaches congregants that the intrinsic value and worth of LGBTQIAP+ lives must always be a given. And my question for that I wrote to myself is that, this is similar to the intent of Black church, period. Is it not?
Yes.
And then while we were sort of getting ready for this, and I'm looking at the cover of your book, and I'm thinking about the Ethiopian eunuch and whosoever, that whole idea that that's what this church is for. And I also just want to sort of backtrack and say how powerful it is that you moved before empire to recognize that the model of the church is pre-empire. We talk about colonialism, we talk about capitalism, but the whole notion of Christianity was anti-empire. And when it was taken over by the empire, it became the aspiration of Christianity, therefore. And we're breaking that down to be those persons that don't aspire to the empire. And doing that, you define this world, and you find the beauty and the nature of your own world, especially within the queer community and in the Black community and in the ways in which we come together and worship. So I just wanted to speak to that idea about your embrace of the redefining or the re-understanding of the necessity of apologetic.
Mm-hmm. Well, if I could tell you just a little personal aspect of a bit about where that really came from. So, we write these things out in this academic language, but the truth is it reverberates in my body, in my Southern dialect, and in my Southern way of thinking, like my grandparents. And so I just got fed up with people asking me, can you explain to me how God loves you being gay? And I just got sick of it. And I got to the place where I started saying to people, let me give you some books to read, because I'm not going to put my body, my lived experiences, or those people that I love in the LGBTQIP+ community who are my friends and my colleagues, I am not going to put them on the altar of contemplation for you to roast them to get to an opinion of your own. That is violent. And it is an act of violence that I think we as queer folk have got to stop acquiescing to. We've got to stop bowing to that altar, thinking that we are somehow creating change or space for ourselves in having these very harmful dialogues with individuals about our existence. So what I wanted to do in this book is to say that this work begins with the truth that LGBTQIA+ plus people are the imago Dei, that we are made in the image and likeness of God. And that if your God that we are made in the image and likeness of is only heterosexual, then that God is not all encompassing. That God is not a reflection of its own creation, which is even more vast. And that that we don't need grace and mercy to be the imago Dei either. I'm going to say this, and I know that it may shake some people the wrong way, but just ride with me. We don't even need the blood of Jesus or baptism to be the imago Dei. And the reason that I'm saying that is because it's the suggestion that, oh, well, you just need to be saved and then you'll be all right. Or, well, if you have grace, then that grace going to cover the sin of homosexuality. So I remember, I had my ex-girlfriend's, yes, I had a girlfriend in high school, and her mom, my grandmother died, and her mom came to the funeral, and my husband was with me. And so when I saw them, she introduced me to Pentecostalism. And when I saw her, she came and she greeted me. And she said, "Oh, sweetheart," she said, "I love you. I just love you. And I want you to know you don't ever have to hide." Now, she meant well with this. But then she said, because, there's grace for everybody. There's grace for everything. And then I remember there was a pastor that I was working for one time. He said to me, he said, "Well, I'm married, but I like Latina women. And so there's grace for me. So there's grace for you." And I said, "Oh, no. What you're not going to do is claim that because you are attracted to women who are not your wife, that the grace that God gives you for that is somehow compared to me. No, I don't need grace and mercy for my existence. God lives, moves, and has God's being in my flesh. This here flesh is not only a container for God's spirit, but it is also a conduit of God's love. This here flesh is God. I am made in the image and likeness of God." And so I begin this work from that premise. So then the question becomes, I remember one of my thinking partners, who's a lawyer, who's not really into the church. He's one of my interlocutors that I have conversations with to make sure that I can reach persons who may not know the church language. And he said to me, he was like, "Well, okay, so what's the purpose of the book? If you're already saying that, what is the purpose?" I said, "The purpose of the book is for people who are trying to figure out how to do this in ecclesial spaces." Nice. It is not written for to prove that queer folk should be accepted. It is written to teach heteronormative folk how to affirm queer folk that God has already affirmed and accepted. What we're really trying to do is I'm trying to help heterosexual people to get their mind to be in Christ, to have their minds to be transformed by the renewing of their minds. I'm trying to transform minds. I'm trying to renew minds in this work. Yeah.
Well, what's so beautiful about this whole way of affirmation is that it also, and your wonderful cautionary about, I am not going to be explaining my existence to you, is it breaks the cycle of church trauma that so many of us live into. When you go to panel discussions and tell me about your church trauma, how we can get over it, we get stuck and re-traumatized again. And telling those stories and those situations get you re-traumatized without being able to claim your victory and claim who you are anyway. And I love once again, I'm going to go back to this Ethiopian eunuch. I mean, I'm a New Testament scholar, but the fact that the Ethiopian eunuch It wasn't Philip that said, "Let me baptize you." He said, "There's water was to stop me from being baptized."
Yes.
It's the own efficacy, and you're claiming the efficacy of the entire LGBTQIA plus spectrum, and understanding that, coming from that place of saying, this water is mine. This water is mine. It didn't exist before, but I see it and it's mine. So that's provided for me. And I understand this in that light, and how incredibly affirming that is. And it just cuts away the need for those, because you talk about denominational queering and how difficult that is and almost impossible that is, because of the structure of the hierarchy. And the hierarchical structure always means that there's someone else that has to be below, that has to be belittled. And you are bucking against that by saying that your self-efficacy and understanding that it is not a gift of grace that you can do anything to earn.
Yes.
It's already a part of the package deal.
Yes. Yes.
And when you speak about that in terms of how your methodologies now, some of the methodologies that you talk about, we talked about the denominational queering, which is thinking about doing the queering of the Black churches from the denominations. And that's all hard because we all know it's mama and them. We all know it's mama and them anyway. So you really do a deep dive into congregational and pastoral queering of churches, and the historical notion of the pastoral leadership that has sort of taken their churches there and gone through some and created some of these processes, which you detail so beautifully in your book. So I just wanted to just sort of have you expand a little bit more on those two notions of the congregational and the pastoral queering, and then even how the congregational very much has a tinge of the pastor has to have that vision as well.
Yes.
And that's leadership, right?
So entering this conversation, I will say that one of the things that I love about being in the academy is that my students are constantly wrestling with my thinking, and they're also pressing me and pushing it. And so one of my students last semester, I mean, it almost made me cry because I get excited when they say, "I think you're wrong about something. I want to expand your argument." There was one student who said, "I think you're slightly wrong about denominational queering not being able to work." And she said, "I am Mormon. And after studying your methods, I actually think the only thing that will work for the Mormon church is a form of denominational queering because of the way that the polity and ecclesial structure is arranged." And I don't remember all of the details, but she did a wonderful argument and wrote a paper on it, so much so that I'm going to include it in the edited volume that I'm working on right now. Denominational queering is when a denomination decides through holy conferencing, especially if you're in the Wesleyan tradition, that the entire denomination is going to affirm LGBTQIP+ folk. So an example of that would be the Episcopal Church, the United Methodist Church. And the problem with queering, though, in my sort of argument that I still stick by, is that queering has to be contextual. And denominational queering makes this decision across a body that has locations in multiple places. And so as a result of that, there is no trickle-down effect. There's no there's a trickle-down effect that just doesn't take place, because there's no way that a higher-end denomination can actually know what is needed in each context. Because to address heteronormativity in New England is vastly different from how you would address heteronormativity in the Delta or in Alabama. It's two completely different contexts. And the problem with denominational queering is that they never provide resources for on the local level. And so they just make a decision and then force all the other constituents to either comply, which has not been done, What they've actually done consistently is they leave it up to the local assemblies to decide if they want to become open and affirming or not. So what does that do? It causes queer folk to think, okay, I can go to any UCC church and be affirmed, and then they walk into a place and maybe this is one of those more conservative ones that doesn't. So that's my sort of description and also issue with denominational queering. Let's move now to pastoral queering.
Before you do that, let me just say to you how much I appreciate that as a Presbyterian.
Yes.
You know, as a Black Presbyterian pastor, because that model of denominational queering, it moved through the people, it moved through the country, but guess who was left out? Black Presbyterians. The conversation was never had with us, because it was always assumed that we would just go along with that, so that we had nowhere else to go. There are other denominations that other people could leave the church and go to, but they've split from the Presbyterian Church because of Blackness in the first place. So I really appreciate that, and understanding that nuance of saying that the top down, if it's the local resources aren't there, and the resources that are provided from the organizations that I worked with to help the Presbyterian Church move to where it's at right now, I even pulled away from some and said, and now I got to do it for my people. That's where it is. So I appreciate that.
And let me say why what you just said is so important and why I wrote this book. Because when our church got ready to go through our process to become open and affirming, all of the materials had blonde hair, white, blue-eyed persons in it. You cannot talk about Black sexuality with white faces. You're going to hit a brick wall before you have the opportunity to even have the dialogue. Because there's already this assumption in many Black contexts that, oh, well, the gay thing is just that white thing. It's that white thing that is bled over into the Black context. And that is just not true. The latter end of my book, I talk about, queering, queerness being in existence in context even prior to colonization. So the second form of queering that I talk about is called pastoral queering. Now, this is the form that is most prevalent in Black churches. And it really has to do with the fact that traditionally Black pastors have been extremely respected and loved by their congregants because the Black preacher was one of the original leaders of the Black community. I think about my grandmother talking about back in the day, it was the school teacher and the preacher and the midwife. Because a lot of smaller communities down south didn't have doctors. They had like a nurse or like a midwife who would help with different things. And so those persons held, very important roles and leadership roles. So I want to first talk about the good in pastoral queering before I critique it. So the good in it is that we get to see preachers whose love for God causes them to step out on a limb, to be courageous in their faith, to say, I love all of God's people. I will pastor all of God's people. I will defend all of God's people. And I will fight for all of God's people. And a lot of times pastoral queering takes place in the form of sermons. Preachers will get up. I think about one of the legendary sermons of Chicago, Trinity United Church of Christ. I'm looking Ace Papa J. What's his name? Jeremiah Wright. Yes. The Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright, one of his legendary sermons was Good News for the Gays.
Right.
I mean, just excellent homiletical presentation. And this is an example of pastoral queering. He does a series called Good News. And he starts off Good News for Blacks. Well, everybody in the church Black. Yeah. So yes, we got that. Good news for the women. Well, the majority of people in the church are women. All right. And then the next one he does is Good News for the Gays. And so what he's done is he's drawing this parallel between other oppressive measures, showing how evil can often be an interlocutor with other evil dynamics. that one oppressive measure is inextricably linked to others. So he does this and he preaches this sermon and it makes people think. I think about also another form of pastoral querying is the Reverend Dr. Senator Raphael G. Warnock, who, when he was running for office, began making affirming statements to LGBTQIA+ folk. We also see this happening with Delman Coates, who likewise, when he was running to be lieutenant governor with an out lesbian woman who was running to be the governor of Maryland at that time. He made affirming statements then, also in connection with the fact that he had a lesbian couple that was worshiping in two separate services because they didn't know if they could sit together.
Right.
I celebrate the courage of preachers who will take that chance to get disinvited from preaching engagements. Delman Coates' stance on LGBTQIA+ rights caused him to get put off of the board for the Hampton Ministers Conference. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on of these persons who were pastors who made this move. Now, here's the problem with it.
Yes.
The problem with pastoral querying is that if the pastor retires, dies, or gets fired, then it is left up to the next pastor to carry on that mantle. And what my research shows is that the majority of new pastors who came in were like, okay, the gay thing was another person's thing. I ain't gonna mess with nobody gay, but I'm just not gonna touch that. And what that does is it leaves queer people out to dry. It leaves them at risk of having to discern if this new preacher is going to be affirming or not, if this space is going to remain affirming. The other thing that it does is that pastoral querying slightly leans into the bully pulpit technique, which, although it can be a form of prophetic urgency and the fierce urgency of now that is driving one, I don't think it's a good pedagogical method for actually getting people to understand what it is that you're really trying to get them to understand, which is a major culture shift. And so a lot of pastoral querying avoids dynamics in which there is a response. Now, an exception to this would be Delman Coates, because he definitely did teach it. He's a New Testament scholar, PhD from Columbia. I mean, he knows how to handle this and how to handle these questions. But often it was in the data, it showed that people were preaching, but they weren't teaching it in Bible study. And I asked one person, now I didn't talk about this in the book because you can't draw a conclusion off of one dynamic, and I didn't see it replicated in other places, but I asked one pastor, why hadn't he? And he said very directly, I'm not ready to respond to those questions. When I preach, the only response is in the affirmative, amen. Or you quiet and don't say nothing, you fold your arms and you pout, but you don't say anything back. But in the context of Bible studies, and this is where he said to me, he was like, Brandon, this is why you got to write this book, because I don't know how to respond to this stuff in the Black context. And the other stuff is too white. I don't know how to respond to it. So that's one of the sort of drawbacks with pastoral querying, is that I describe it actually as the lazier form of querying, because denominational querying requires a lot of politics and a lot of money to undergird those political moves. Congregational querying takes a lot of work as well, but the pastoral querying one takes courage, but there isn't always a lot of substantive sort of dialogue taking place and facilitation of that dialogue. Now, congregational querying, that's the holy grail. That is the one that takes the longest, and it's messy. Ooh, if you don't want to get messy, don't do congregational querying. Stick with pastoral querying. That's the least messy. But the more messy it is, the more likely the querying technique is able to stick. So congregational querying becomes messy because you open it up for complete dialogue, for people to talk. The other thing that gets really messy around congregational querying, and this is where I teach a class called Querying the World here at Harvard. I'm still here. I've been here since 9 o'clock this morning teaching my class. And one of the things I say is that if you are an LGBTQIP plus person who has experienced trauma in the church, you do not need to attempt trying to queer a church until you have dealt with that trauma. Because congregational queering requires that you open up the threshing floor, and you cannot become so dogmatic in your liberalism that you don't create space for people to ask honest questions and to let their ignorance hang out. We look at ignorance like it's a bad word, but ignorance is just a gap in knowledge and information that can be filled with knowledge to prevent one's ignorance from continuing. But you can't create an environment in which people are afraid to let their ignorance hang out. The space must create a space for vulnerability, for people to be able to ask honest questions. Let me give you one example of an honest question that was asked in a queering context when I was doing some consultant work at a church. And it was an honest question of, Rev, I don't get the pronouns. I'm not trying to hurt nobody's feelings, but I just don't understand how I'm talking to one person and then I'm using a pronoun that's plural. I'm just trying to understand how it works with syntax. This woman, her being transparent about herself, this was a 75-year-old former English teacher. Now, immediately, there was a person who was non-gender conforming that started explaining all of these pronouns and all these different things. And I could look at the person and tell she was completely confused. And so what I said to her in response is, I said, well, there are people in the world who identify as something different than the gender that was assigned to them by a doctor at birth. And I know that trying to figure out how to either reconfigure or which pronoun is appropriate is difficult. And so what I want to suggest that you do is try doing what I've asked my church members to try and start doing in our project to take gender completely away from the concept of the divine. And that is, where you would normally use a pronoun, just use God's name. God said, God said, God said, God said. And I said, so for you, the way to just avoid everything with the pronoun, just call the person by their name. If they tell you that their name is Jim, just continue using the word Jim. Now, this was a context in which a person felt safe enough to ask a question because they wanted to know an honest answer, because they felt like they had the potential to misgender someone, which could cause harm in their context. And they were not trying to cause harm. They just didn't understand how to frame it. So that's just an example of how we must be very careful that we don't become dogmatic in our liberalism, because dogmatic liberalism shuts the door for the evolution of thought in the minds of those who aren't traditionally exposed to this way of thinking.
I hear you on that. Oh, boy, you just preaching. I'm just getting all warm up in here. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. That whole way of having those conversational spaces and being in those places. I believe a friend of mine once said, we do a lot of talking in church, but we don't do a lot of conversating and conversation and really a lot of dialogue, putting it that way. But we do a lot of talking, but not a lot of dialogue. And that dialogue and that dialogical is really an important distinction that you're talking about. And it actually, the messiness that you're talking about, it reminds me of that wonderful, wonderful Japanese art where the ceramic bowl is, when it falls and it breaks to pieces, how they pour gold into it and it becomes something new. It becomes reusable and it becomes new and beautiful, another thing and another entity in and of itself. So that messiness really does help to create something more beautiful in that context. And the distinction that you made between the pastor who says, well, I'm going to leave now, so it's time for me to go. It's really a very powerful notion to say, if you can't bring the people, Kintsugi, yes, thank you, Carrie. If you can't bring the congregation fully along in the dialogue and say that the dialogue will continue because things continue to shift. Your models and your interventions and your methodologies actually are so fluid that they allow us to be able to deal with the shifting nature of our communities, and also to be responsive to the voice, the changing voice of God, how God is speaking to us to love one another and be with one another. And I think that that's a really important distinction about that. So I'm really excited about that. I do know that we're going to be getting some questions pretty soon. So I've opened up the chat a little bit, and I'm trying to figure out where some of these are. And I just want to just thank Derrick and thank Isaiah and those guys for being able to help us through some of that. But before we get there, I want to encourage not only people to buy the book, but to make everyone read the appendix number 2. The appendix number 2, which gives the 8 phases of Black ecclesial query and all the other detailed bullet noted things that actually help you sort of decode in a congregational way how to actually be in conversation with, just say, I can look through this and say, oh, this is a form. I can sort of do this, but then you break into it. And that appendix is so powerful. And I just wanted to affirm that your inclusion of that appendix and the appendices are just as important as every story and all the ideas about the narratology that needs to be done and the telling of the stories and the conversation in those brave spaces. This is really important. And so I wanted to encourage everyone also to get in those appendices, get into the index, and then go back and see where it leads you, because that's sort of one of the best ways to sort of decode a lot of the academic work that we do. But it's also a way for academics to sort of really sort of outline and highlight. It's very teachable as well. And I wanted to thank you for that. It's also a very wonderful pedagogical tool for community and churches. And I say community because we do know that there are a lot of people who are outside of the church community who are trying to figure out what this means as well. And the last point that I want to make before I get to a question is you speak very clearly about some of the commonalities of the groups that you spoke with and the churches that you spoke with. And I just have to point out that you were talking about same gender loving people and LGBTQ plus people who have been in the church for years, talking with mostly older folks and this and that. And I wanted to ask you this question, and you answered it beautifully already with dogmatic liberalism. But I want to encourage us to understand that it's not too late for the young voices, because they've tuned out, because this is the conversations that they're used to having. They're used to having them in Central Park when people gather to talk about their religious sensibilities and how they feel about their trauma with church, but how they still feel about where God is. These are the conversations that they're having. So you've proven that the church, it's not too late for anybody. You know, everybody said the church is dying and so on. Well, God is alive and creating the context that this is a space for everyone. It's very powerful and very affirming, especially when you talk about transgender affirmation, the erotic, the erotic and speaking about the erotic so beautifully, the Black male neurotic, the lesbian erotic, and the transgender erotic. It brings it home. This is not just an academic mind thing. It's not just a community thing. That this is people's lived lives and experience. And it's just beautiful. So thank you for that.
Thank you. You know, I'm trying to keep myself from crying right now because I know you're an academic. You know, you just pour your heart into these works, and to just hear you talk about it, and the way you're talking about it, it proves that you actually did read it. It is just it's a blessing, and it's very affirming to me to be able to hear that. I will say, I do want to say something just quickly about this concept of the erotic. And when I wrote that section, it was maybe the third week of the pandemic in April. It was like when it was at its height. And I was going stir crazy. I mean, just absolute. I was only 3 weeks in and I was about to lose it. And that was when one of my mentors said to me, "You just need to write." And she said, "Just start writing.
Yeah.
I know you need to get this book done, but just start writing and just let whatever come. And so I started just writing. And then I got off into this and I thought, oh no, this is too much. I think they're gonna really think I'm crazy. They're gonna throw me overboard with this, especially when I started trying to redefine pleasure as being a salvific and divine thing. So my grandmother who raised me, who just passed, she got to read the whole book from cover to cover, and I have a picture that I often show with her sitting in her little slippers, you know, reading the book. And so she called me. She said, "I read the whole thing, baby, because you wrote it." She said, "And now I didn't understand a lot of it." She said, "But
That's it.
that eroticism stuff." I said, "What, Mama?" She said, "That eroticism." She said, "Now that was a little freaky. That was a little out there." She's like, "That piece kind of got me." And I thought to myself, but she read it. She got through it. And, you know, she started then asking me questions. She said, she's gone on to heaven now, so she can't get embarrassed. She was like, "I never really had anybody to talk about sex with." She said, "Because I thought it was something I couldn't talk to God about. I couldn't talk to nobody about. So it was always something that was in secret. And I really didn't always know what to do or how to find pleasure. And you were talking about pleasure was a good thing. And she said to me, she said, that was really the first time that I seen something talking about God and sex and pleasure all in the same vein." And I thought to myself, she may not have completely embraced that whole concept, but it got her to thinking. And if that's what it can do to a 90-year-old woman who don't know anything about queer theory, nothing, then hopefully it can help to expand the consciousness of other persons who may be around her age bracket to find freedom and to find pleasure at their age. I remember just talking about, we got into a conversation around, masturbation, and she was just like, "Well, I just can't believe we're talking about this." And I said, "Well, Mom, it's pleasure, and it's a natural human experience. It is a celebration of one's ability to give oneself pleasure or to perhaps even share that with another." And, she wrapped her mind around it and she was like, "Well, I guess I'm too old to get off into it now, but I really wish I had learned about this earlier."
Well, you know what else is beautiful? There's a question that has been posted that this is sort of speaks to in this beautiful way about the sexuality. It's sort of the demonization of Black gay men in church and spaces, and it causes so many of us to abandon church communities and lesbians and transgenders as well, and to be embraced by white majority and affirming churches in a way that sort of. Well, one of the questions is where does the change need to happen that allows Black community to embrace and nurture Black LGBTQI and A persons? And the roundabout way, larger way of eroticism that we were just talking about is a physical way and a spiritually erotic way to think about that as well, to demystify some of that. When I teach the Song of Solomon, and I have people fanning themselves saying, "Whoo, This is why they didn't want me to read this, huh?
Yeah.
You know, it starts to demystify and take away the demonization of just eroticism. And when you do that with eroticism, it starts to happen with sensuality, and you can start embracing all these other senses. And if you can't even understand that, but you understand pleasure, there's a way of doing that. But the question does remain, though, and I think people would be really interested to hear your answer to that question. Where does the change need to happen that allows Black community to embrace and nurture Black LGBTQ&I persons? And also, why do Black heterosexual people accept and embrace their gay white colleagues, but can't accept gayness in Black bodies? Fusing those two together.
So anytime we're responding to a problem, it's important to do a deep dive into history. And so in order to understand the true complexity and dynamics at play within Black heteronormativity in all of its iterations, forms, and manifestations, it's going to be important for one to understand the history of Black homophobia. And I want to encourage the person who posed that question. I'm going to try in 1 minute to give a response, but the thick answer that you really need is in that first chapter. And
Right.
and that first chapter is very thick, it's very dense, but I wrote it because I wanted to really have a sort of beginning history for us to start with. I'm a theologian and a religious scholar. I'm not a historian. And I'm very clear about that. So what my hope is that this first chapter will spark some Black queer historian to maybe want to bounce off of what I've said to thicken it a bit more, and to add some nuances, and even to talk about some ways where maybe I may have gotten it wrong even. But I would suggest reading that chapter. So where does it need to start? Well, I think the first thing that we need to do is to start within our own families. I think the family is the sort of first space that we need to do the work around loving and affirming one another and getting to know one another, and realizing that our differences should not be used to separate us, but that they are indications of God's vastness that is alive within us, that God is not singular, that God is multiple things. And so our humanity is a reflection of that. So I would say starting with families. And the reason I say that families is important is because a lot of the contexts that have been most receptive to queering are contexts in which there have been persons who've had family members who were queer that they love and would even say, now listen, you're going to leave them alone. So I would say that that's the first sort of dynamic, because I would dare to suggest that many of us are able to practice a hermeneutics of suspicion in our familial circles. Some of the most extremely homophobic persons I know will say a homophobic statement in a sermon, and then they'll say something next to it like, and I got gay people in my family, and I love them. So, I think that family dynamic is the sort of first move. Why does that become the first move? Because according to I'm trying to remember the organization that did the research around queer youth, and the suicide rate and the drug rate. I'm trying to remember the organization. It's slipping my mind right now. But one of the things that the data shows is that LGBTQIAP+ young persons who have families that affirm them and that love them, are less likely to transition by self-termination, and are often less likely to deal with substance usage and abuse. That there is something about having a supportive Trevor Project. Thank you so much, Holmes. Thank you so much. That we are. I lost my train of thought there. That when a young person has a supportive context and community, that they are more able to thrive. So I would say starting with families first. families having hard conversations and being in community with each other. And then let's talk about the Black community. I have also found that Black communities often practice an aspect of being open and welcoming, maybe not always affirming. I think about the fact that the queer folk who lived in on Rock Street, where the projects were when I grew up, as long as they stayed on their block, everybody knew. It was like, that's our residential gay person. That's our Uncle James. That's our this on the street. Everybody knew it. There was not an issue of people worrying about their children. But that was their residential gay person in their neighborhood. And people would fight for them and defend them and love them. And maybe still think it's sin, but there was an aspect of where that was present. Now, we can't take care of you when you go over to the hood in Rome. We can't help you when you go over to the hood across the town, across the street, or when you go from one borough in New York to the other borough. We can only protect you here. But I find that there is that element there. And so what is it about our family dynamics and our social dynamics that give us the ability to be in community with queer folk? But then it's like we check all of that empathy at the vestibule, and it doesn't translate into the sacred space. It means we need to excavate and interrogate our concept of the sacred and what that means, and why we are creating certain things as profane and certain things as secular. What is this separation that we have between the secular and the sacred? And when we pose that question, this is getting me back to chapter 1, because chapter 1 is essentially the answer to the question.
Yeah.
When you realize that dichotomy exists, it makes you ask, okay, where did this come from? Because it definitely is not African. Because there is no separation between the secular and the sacred from where we come from. This is a product of colonialism. This is a product of Constantinian Christianity. And it was not intended to be such by God. Yeah.
Well, you know, my brother, there are other questions, but we are at our time. And we are at our time, and there's some resources in the chat, so people do say the chat. And I am so grateful to you, Reverend Dr. Brendan Thomas Crowley, to make your acquaintance, to know your spirit, and have had this conversation with you. I've only touched on 1.5 pages of my notes that I took, but I'm satisfied and overjoyed and happy for this to continue to grow. So I look forward to that, and I thank you for this incredible conversation, and I'm looking forward to more. I do know that they're gonna sign us off pretty soon and let us know that we're gonna stay around for a little bit in case somebody does want to stay around and just be a little bit conversant. But okay. Thank you once again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and God bless you, Pastor. Thank you for this opportunity and dialogue.
Thank you again so much. More thank yous, Brandon and Derrick, for this thoughtful, provocative discussion. There were a lot of amens in the chat box as we went along. Thanks to all of you who participated, offered comments. Within a few days, you will all receive an email with a link to a recording of tonight's program that you can share with friends and colleagues. If you are interested in more opportunities to explore the history of queer religious movements, check out the LGBTQ-RAN website, and particularly our events page. There you will find announcements of future online programs, as well as recordings of past presentations. LGBTQ-RAN invites you all to our annual gala celebration coming up on Sunday evening, October 20th. This online event will honor several prominent queer religious leaders: Rabbi Alan Bennett, Reverend Nicole Garcia, Reverend Darlene Garner, Reverend Dr. Carter Hayward, Reverend Brandon Robertson, as well as the group Pride in the Pews. The gala will also spotlight LGBTQ-RAN's momentous work to preserve and proclaim LGBTQ religious history. Sign up to get the Zoom link for this festive gathering.
On behalf of everyone here, I offer much gratitude to Derrick and Brandon for their inspiring presentation, and good night to you all.